40-year-old Alexis Tsipras is the new Prime Minister of Greece.
Is Syriza's victory good or is it bad for Greece?
Πλήρη αλλαγή του πολιτικού σκηνικού στη χώρα, κυρίες και κύριοι, σηματοδοτεί η χθεσινή ιστορική νίκη του ΣΥΡΙΖΑ και
the rise of left-wing parties all over Europe.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories that we've been tracking this week. Showdown in Athens. The new government says it's out to get the oligarchs and the media outlets they control. They say journalism is covering history on the run. This reporter is on the run after breaking a news story in Argentina. And Yemen. Where does the power lie? Where do journalists draw the line? When politicians take power, they always have promises to fulfill. Sometimes they make good on them. Sometimes they don't. But seldom do those promises sound anything like this one. We are going to destroy the oligarchy system. That's what Greece's new government, a coalition led by Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras, says it's going to do. And when they talk about going after the oligarchs, they're not just talking about the banks whose failings brought the country's economy to its knees or the energy sector. They're talking about the media, which the new government says has an unholy alliance with business interests that sponge off the state. This is a story that the rest of Europe is watching closely and reporting on extensively, given the more than 200 billion euros that Greece owes its European creditors after two bailouts. Syriza was elected not because of the coverage it got during the campaign, but despite it. However, news organizations that were once outwardly hostile to the party can read polls too. They saw which way the wind was blowing and they were changing their tune long before a single vote was cast. The question is, what happens now that Syriza's in power? Will the new government really take on big business and the media that the oligarchs control? And if so, how? Our starting point this week is the birthplace of democracy, Athens. Talk to Greeks and they will tell you that this wasn't a typical election.
And the winner is?
It wasn't, they say, a conventional ideological fight between the left and right that have defined Greek politics since World War II. This was an election with the air of a referendum. It was about austerity, the Syriza party that opposed it, the incumbent party that supported it, and the media, most of which was pro-austerity and therefore anti-Syriza.
The Greek media landscape is divided between media which support the bailout and media which do not support the bailout. So it's not that politicized as it was before the crisis. I consider it a very big success of Syriza that it managed to become elected without having a heavy support from the so-called mainstream Greek media.
Οι διοικήσεις των τραπεζών είναι αρκετά προβληματισμένες από την μαζική εκροή καταθέσεων.
Which during the pre-election campaign had a very negative coverage of the program of Syriza, suggesting that it could not be viable and sustainable in the case the party would govern.
What's really strange about the rise of Syriza in Greek politics is the fact that for the previous 2 years they have been the main opposition party, does not have one single big newspaper, big TV channel being even remotely friendly to its agenda. We've seen this strange phenomenon whereby the majority of the big media, pretty much everybody, was against Syriza.
On the other hand, however, two mainstream important Greek newspapers like to Vima and Ta Nea have started to see Mr. Tsipras in a relatively positive way a few days before the election, and also in their front pages, as far as Ta Nea is concerned, the day after the election, considering the situation as a historical opportunity of the left.
That was some last-minute pragmatism because pretty much all of the major media outlets in Greece have owners who are pro-austerity and therefore oppose Syriza. And for years, they had been doing billions of euros worth of business with the same politicians their media outlets were supposed to be keeping honest. Here are just three of the major players. A large part of Mega TV and the Ethnos newspaper are owned by George Boboulas and members of his family. He is also a mining and construction magnate through his holding company, Elaktor. Vardis Vardinoyannis has a big stake in Piraeus, Greece's biggest bank. His company is also into energy and shipping and controls Star TV, multiple radio stations, and more than 20 magazines. Stavros Tsikaras heads a group that has interests ranging from printing to real estate to tourism, along with major newspapers Tovima and Tanea, as well as magazines. And Bobolas, Vardinoyanis, and Tsikaras are joined at the corporate hip through their shared ownership or involvement in Teletipos, the company that operates the aforementioned Mega TV, one of Greece's biggest channels.
The media, the big channels and the big newspapers are owned by what we call the Greek oligarchs. The Greek oligarchs are super rich ship owners or people that own construction companies or people that have close ties with the previous governments and that have been having favors. This so-called impartiality and objectivity. There is no such thing. There is no such thing in the Greek media. There is no such thing in the international media, given the fact that they're owned by super rich.
And what will you do to the oligarchy concretely?
We are going to destroy the basis upon which they have built for decade after decade a system and network that...
Yes, Yannis Varoufakis, the current Greek finance minister, has told Channel 4 that Syriza plans to destroy the basis of what he described as an unholy alliance of bankrupt bankers, developers, and media owners who have steered the debate on austerity in Greece. I would say that to a great extent, this would be more of an electioneering thing to do rather than something that we can expect. I mean, it's a very difficult riddle to untangle in the first place.
And untangle is the right word because the term Greeks use to describe their oligarchs is diaplekomeni, which translates to the entangled. And while the quality of Greek journalism is in doubt, the quantity is not. In 2009, on the eve of the economic crisis, Greece had 39 national newspapers in a country of just 11 million. As the U.S. Embassy in Athens put it in 2006 in a diplomatic cable published by WikiLeaks, how can all these media outlets operate profitably? They don't. They are subsidized by their owners who use the media primarily to exercise political and economic influence. This time, with this election, they did not get the result they wanted. The answer to the question why, at least part of it, can be found online.
Syriza, given the fact that its main supporting base are young people, used a lot new media, social media, alternative media, websites. Syriza supporters are those who read between the lines, are those who don't listen to the news the way that older people do, are those who will search a bit more on the internet, who will do some research online, because people that voted for Syriza understand that the mainstream narrative is not the correct one.
They prefer newer, independent media. Most of these are online, naturally, because it is cheaper. You can cite media online like Press Project or different websites like Omnia TV. Our magazine, Unfollow, is one of these media, and Hot Doc is another one of these independent media. They mostly tend to get their information from these kind of sources. A younger public, a public that is more politicized, perhaps a little bit more radical, wants a different kind of reporting, a different kind of journalism.
The new government wants a different kind of journalistic landscape. Easier said than done, given the complexities of corporate ownership and the web of ties that corporations have long had to the government that Syriza has just inherited. It's like the Greek fable of the Gordian knot, often used as a metaphor for an intractable problem. Legend has it that Alexander the Great just took a knife to it. Prime Minister Tsipras and Syriza wish it was that easy, as they prepare to take on the media barons and untangle Greeks from the entangled. On the download this week, our viewers on the various kinds of coverage that they're seeing on the political story in Greece.
The media in Greece has been much less judgmental and biased towards the new government than the European and international press. The German press refers to Prime Minister Tsipras in a negative and one-sided format, which creates an unnecessary atmosphere of hostility. The international press should recognize the new situation, and instead of being frightened by it, it should look at it as what it is, a democratic process, and work more towards a balanced media coverage.
We're always open to viewer feedback and ideas. If you've got an opinion on the news media, just go to our Facebook or Twitter page. Our Twitter handle is @AJ Listening Post. Then fire up your camera, make a worthwhile point, hit send, and we'll see you on the download. Other media stories that are on our radar this week: the Kremlin's plan to bulk up its media apparatus has been partly undone, at least temporarily, by the crash of the ruble and falling oil prices. State-owned news outlets that had been growing in size and budgets have been forced to scale back instead of expanding. News agencies Rossiya Segodnya and TASS are among the hardest hit. Rossiya Segodnya will lose 50% of its budget, TASS 25% of its staff. The state-owned broadcaster RT got off easy. Originally promised a 30% funding boost this year, it will see its budget hiked by just 10%. RT's editor-in-chief, Margarita Simonyan, says plans to create French and German language channels will probably be shelved. When Moscow announced its plans to spend more money on the media and its soft power push, it said it was something it had to do in order to counter what it calls an anti-Russian bias in the Western media, particularly over the story in Ukraine. A journalist has fled from his native Argentina, saying that he feared for his life after revealing that a prosecutor in a potentially explosive legal case had died of a bullet to the head. Damien Pachter, a reporter for the English-language Buenos Aires Herald, was the first to report that the prosecutor, Alberto Nisman, was dead and that the circumstances were suspicious. Nisman's body was found 2 weeks ago, the day before he was to testify at a congressional hearing. He had already alleged that President Cristina Fernández de Kirchner and other Argentinian officials had covered up the truth about Iranian involvement in a 1994 bombing of a Jewish community center in Buenos Aires that killed 85 people. Nisman was working on the premise that a deal had been struck between Argentina and Iran, impunity in exchange for oil. Pachter, the reporter, disappeared before surfacing in Israel, where he says he has citizenship. He spoke to reporters upon his arrival at the airport in Tel Aviv.
They used their security forces to chase me, and I just had to move fast and quick.
Argentina's presidential palace then posted the details of his flight path on its Twitter page. The cabinet chief defended that, saying, if a journalist says that he feels threatened, it's important to publish his whereabouts. President Kirchner says she plans to dissolve Argentina's intelligence network and replace it with a new federal intelligence agency. World leaders descended on Paris for that unity rally for freedom of expression that followed the shootings there. Then many of them went on to Riyadh to pay their respects to the late Saudi king Abdullah. The coverage was interesting. There was lots of reporting on Michelle Obama choosing not to cover her head, although she is hardly the first Western woman to do that in Saudi Arabia. Bloomberg News actually reported that Mrs. Obama's image had been blurred out by Saudi state-run television. That was false. It never happened, as the Saudi Arabian embassy in Washington helpfully pointed out. The International Business Times, headquartered in the U.S., described Abdullah as a woman's rights advocate, despite the fact that women are still banned from driving in Saudi Arabia and that 4 of the late king's daughters were under house arrest. The publication issued a quasi-correction. The Gulf Daily News in Bahrain called Abdullah a man of peace, despite those diplomatic cables revealed by WikiLeaks in which Abdullah asked the U.S. to attack Iran in 2008 in order to, as the quote said, cut the head off the snake. As for the governments represented in Paris and then Riyadh, such as the Turkish government that sent President Erdogan, we looked for reports of those leaders raising the freedom of expression issue with the new king, but we could not find any. The oil-rich kingdom recently jailed and flogged a blogger for daring to criticize the same monarchy that global leaders and the media were paying tribute to. To be a journalist in Yemen these days means not knowing where you stand, what you can report. A lot has changed there in a relatively short time. Just 4 years ago, the country was still under the control of President Ali Abdullah Saleh, who spent more than 3 decades in power. That all came to an end in 2012. Then, last year, Houthi fighters took control of large parts of the capital, Sana'a. And last week, when President Abdu Rabu Mansur Hadi handed in his resignation, he effectively handed power over to the Houthis. Throughout the transitions, Yemeni journalists have been largely free to go about their work. But given the rise of the new political powers, they're never really sure of how far they can take their coverage, where the red lines are. Then there's the supposedly covert U.S. drone war against al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, or AQAP. Washington calls the group one of the most dangerous offshoots of al-Qaeda, but that's a tough thing to verify. Very few journalists actually get close enough to report on the movement, let alone on the drone strikes against it, which have been known to claim the lives of innocents. And that lack of reporting has created a news and information vacuum that AQAP and its affiliates are only too happy to fill. The Listening Post's Nick Muirhead now on Yemen and the challenges that reporters face while trying to cover a complex and shifting political landscape.
When Yemenis took to the streets of Sana'a last week, some were there to support, others to protest the Shia Houthis' takeover of the capital. Reports came in that journalists were being targeted, arrested, beaten, forbidden from covering the demonstrations, caught in the middle of a power struggle. It all started 3 years ago this month, with the ouster of President Ali Abdullah Saleh after 33 years in the presidential palace. Yemeni journalists moved into uncharted waters.
The absence of clear power structure in the country has confused journalists. It has also severely undermined good investigative journalism on, let's say, the spectacular rise of the Shia Houthis here in the capital Sana'a, or on al-Qaeda expanding in the central part of the country, or on the secessionist movement, because journalists are afraid. They think they might get jailed, punished, sometimes even killed by powerful tribesmen or people affiliated with the government.
However, at the same time, because of this lack of control, they have an ability to talk about things that they perhaps wouldn't have been able to do before. And now when you go to a newspaper stand, for example, in Sana'a, you'll see different newspapers side by side criticizing different political figures, government policy, and various other things, and there's a wide array of opinions there.
You've had this proliferation of, I don't know, yellow media outlets, for lack of a better word, affiliated with all sorts of political parties, basically publishing rubbish. The new media freedom has just been a double-edged sword. Before, I think people didn't necessarily think the government was telling the truth. Now, no one really has any idea who's telling the truth.
On January 22nd, President Abdu Rabu Mansur Hadi quit over his government's confrontation with the Houthis. He was a key ally of the US in its covert drone war against al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, or AQAP. However, just 3 days later, a US drone strike reportedly killed 3 men that officials claim belonged to al-Qaeda. But for now, their word is all that we have to go on, because journalists very rarely get to report from the scene of these attacks.
According to the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, since 2002 there have been between 72 and 84 confirmed drone strikes in Yemen, more than 100 unconfirmed cases. They're mostly taking place in the south, in provinces like Shabwa and Abyan, which are hundreds of kilometers from the capital. Which is why it is so important that journalists are allowed to report freely. But that isn't happening, and the primary reason is access.
Of course, it's hard for international journalists for security reasons. It needs some deep understanding of the local complexities to get access to whatever information you need in Yemen.
Some of those areas are either under the control of al-Qaeda or disgruntled tribesmen, and we've seen many cases of international journalists kidnapped by those people or those political factions. I'm talking about Houthi-controlled areas in Sa'da. I'm talking about Shabwa, Abiyan, Hadramaut, which are now under the control of al-Qaeda. I'm talking about areas under the control of secessionists in the south, or areas controlled by independent tribesmen like in Ma'rib and Al-Jawf.
Now, local journalists face different kind of more complex issues. They perhaps can go to those areas, but then there's a question of, number one, are these journalists trustworthy, for example, when they're reporting on certain issues? People might not take their word for it. Secondly, they're much more at risk from local figures, and they're much more at risk of being violently attacked or being silenced.
Case in point, Abdu Ella Haidar Shaya. In December 2009, the Yemeni journalist traveled to the site of a drone strike to verify the Yemeni government's claim that it had carried out the attack against Al-Qaeda. What he found were US missile parts that were not in the Yemeni arsenal, and that among the casualties were women and children. 7 months later, he was arrested and sentenced to 5 years in prison for having links to Al-Qaeda. Shaya remained in jail at the insistence of the Obama administration until 2013, when he was released and put under house arrest. Among the news outlets that he worked for are Al Jazeera, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and ABC News. Without journalists like Abdul Ella Haidar Shaya, the international media are reliant on the official version of events.
So when events happen around the country and a number of people may have died, the government will put out a press release, or they will have a spokesman go and say terrorists have been killed, when in reality it was civilians that were killed. And unless any independent people can go down and verify that, that's going to be the story, and that's always what is picked up by the international media.
Let me assure you, most of what written in international media about Yemen, whether security or non-security, it misinforms more than it informs. There has been cases where I see it reported in international media, militants were killed in this drone strike. And by the end of the day, I know these people are civilians. But no one knows, and militants has been one of the easy words you can just put there to define anyone.
What the US and Yemeni governments want you to believe is that the victims of drone attacks are members of Al-Qaeda.
تستمر أمريكا بارتكاب جرائم القتل الوحشية.
But AQAP isn't taking that narrative lying down. It's pushing back with its own propaganda.
Al-Qaeda is on an offensive to win the hearts and minds of the Yemenis. And they've been smartly using social media in a way or another to promote that narrative. They basically say to Yemenis, you have to unite with us to fight the Americans and to fight this government.
When there's been a drone attack, often what Al-Qaeda will do will be to go to places where these drone attacks have happened and start doing vox pops in the streets with locals, asking them how they feel about what's happened, how angry they are, and how the Yemeni government are simply stooges to the West. And that's a problem now that the West and the Yemeni government have to face. If they're not letting independent and, say, neutral figures go and cover these stories, other people are going to take advantage.
It remains to be seen how effective Al-Qaeda's sort of propaganda campaign has been. But the fact is, even people who despise Al-Qaeda are still watching this stuff, and it's being spread very widely outside of official channels, which means that AQAP has had much more success than other more mainstream groups in Yemen, and that in itself is a victory.
Gone are the days where the authorities could bury the truth, keep journalists away from the story and wait for it to blow over. If traditional journalists can't report the real story, others will step in and tell it their way. And that is something the new powers that be in Yemen and others will have to deal with.
More viewers on the download now on the state of journalism in Yemen.
Specialized journalists on drone who challenged the US admin's narrative about drones in Yemen, these journalists have faced imprisonment, assault, and even deportation from the country. It seems there is a joint determination by the US admin and the Yemeni government to keep ambiguity about the truth of these targeted killings so they can control the general public opinion.
In 1990, Yemeni thought that they reached the peak of democracy when newspapers were finally allowed to open after the end of totalitarian regimes in both the north and the south. But this was not the reality. Later on, even an armed militia, the way we have now, is still controlling the state TV and still chasing journalists and citizen journalists. This leaves us with one alternative, which is the internet. But the question remains, how many Yemenis have access to this tool?
Typically, we like to end the program on an amusing note, but this time we won't, because this weekend, Sunday, marks the 400th day of the imprisonment of our journalists in Egypt. Bahar Mohammed, Peter Gresta, and Mohammed Fahmy, whose cases are all awaiting retrial, are guilty of nothing more than practicing journalism in a country that has apparently forgotten what journalism is. Al Jazeera continues to demand their release, as do news organizations the world over and the people who work for them. We'll see you next time at The Listening Post.